Good afternoon, everyone. Happy Aldersgate Day to everyone here and everyone else out in the Zooniverse. I'm honoured to be giving today's lecture. Thanks to Peter and his colleagues for the invitation, and to Lincoln for their hospitality. And many thanks to Tom Dobson from Oxford Brookes and Lindsay McCormack from Lincoln for the wonderful little exhibition outside. I'd like to also just start off by saying, acknowledging my thanks to Professors Randy Maddox. Randy, I think you're out there in the States, and Ken Newport and Dr. Gareth Lloyd for involving me in some of the projects that Peter mentioned just now. I'm going to do a quick plug for them. It was deciphering documents for those editions which led me to want to explore a bit more about the context of Wesley's shorthand further. I've published a little bit more about this for anyone that wants to read more, but a big shortcoming of what I have published is their complete lack of illustrations, and part of the point of my lecture is trying to make up for that today. So I'd better begin. My title alludes to this letter John Wesley received from his brother Charles in October 1736. At the time, they were in Savannah and Boston, respectively. It's written in a mixture of longhand and shorthand, mingling English, Greek, and Latin. Here's the relevant section closer up. If you are desirous, as I am, of a correspondence, you must set upon Byron's shorthand immediately. After the Greek, which also encourages John to write shorthand, the bit in green says, "It's our only way of conversing, like the needles of the two friends." Shorthand gets linked with an imaginary precursor of later communication technologies, the sympathetic telegraph, first described in the 16th century by cryptographer Giambattista della Porta, a device whereby friends at a distance might communicate using magnetic dial plate needles. The shorthand goes on to mention how Charles Delamotte, who had accompanied John to Georgia, is using it, quote, for this very reason, and will, quote, transcribe your journal as everything else in shorthand. I'll return to this letter and touch on the image's pertinence later, but before doing so, I want to give an overview of the uses to which the Wesleys put shorthand and why Charles was urging his brother it should be Byron's in particular. In contextualizing this, my underlying theme today is that future text-centered projects on Wesleyan manuscripts might do well to present more of it directly, to engage further with shorthand's materiality. During the Wesleys' lifetime, the take-up of Byron's shorthand moved beyond a small but growing coterie to more widespread circulation after publication in 1767 and subsequent popularization in new editions into the 19th century. A fundamental reason the Wesleys used it, and why they ditched an inferior system they'd been learning in its favour, was that they were personally acquainted with its inventor. They belonged to what we might think of his scribal community. John Wesley's personal diaries are probably the most famous of all surviving manuscripts employing Byron. Here's their very last page, penned the week he died, after almost 60 years of using shorthand. And I'm showing a plate in Nehemiah Kernock's standard edition, now over 100 years old. For all its faults, a monumental achievement. The final bit in yellow reads Thursday the 24th, but then nothing more. The previous day, amidst formulaic registering of prayer, conversation and visits, he notes his continuing reading of Equiano's narrative. That reference links to his very last known letter, the same day to Wilberforce, about American slavery, the vilest that ever saw the sun. If I'm right to assume the letter was composed before the diary entry, it makes the Thursday heading his very last known writing, apart from a brief note on a letter 4 days later, certainly the last thing, I think, in shorthand. While still exhibiting his distinctive ductum aspect in contrast with earlier documents, the quavering hand is telling, moving in emphasizing deteriorating health. It's a graphic dimension which print transcription just doesn't convey, as Kernock recognized in supplying his plate. But the shorthand's arguably a bit clearer to decipher than the longhand, less tremulous. Shorthand imposes less physical demand on the hand than longhand, which, quite simply, takes longer to write. requiring more movement and directional change of tool, here quill pen, upon substrate, here paper. Less ink means less time on quill cutting and dipping, reducing neck and shoulder strain too. Maybe when he first started using shorthand, Wesley even had foresight of such ergonomic advantages for older age. Whether or not he did, its use here testifies to a tenacity of stenographic diary keeping. Shorthand's long been built into a daily routine. The writing below Thursday's heading is John's one-time amanuensis, Henry Moore. "Oh, that I might so follow him as he followed Christ," Moore exclaims in the blue highlighted bit. Today it's shocking, a manuscript like this subjected to such paratextual intervention, but more charitably, we might see it less as a defacement than a tribute, demonstrating a sort of paleographic bond. One of those to whom Wesley bequeathed his manuscripts, to be burned or published as they see good, Moore subsequently came into most, but who knows what disappeared in the meantime. We shudder at John Pawson's account of going through Wesley's papers and, quote, casting away abundance of useless, worthless lumber. Pawson did send Moore, quote, some of the little books, of which there are a good many, mostly written in his own shorthand. This might have included his diaries, and if so, maybe the fact it was just some explains the major gaps in the surviving sequence. But it's impossible to assess the full extent of Wesley's stenographizing. Shorthand's always been a victim of domestic clear-outs, especially when it can't be read, when it's assumed to be superseded textually by longhand copy, when it's recent, but not that recent, or when it's contained in dirty, crumbling old stationery books bound in reverse calf, which stain your hands, or on tatty scraps not bound at all. Moore remembered Charles Wesley using shorthand when writing in his late 70s. Sorry about the silly photo. Couldn't resist it. Didn't know there were cameras in the 18th century. In the vignette quoted here, shorthand's an aid for capturing words on the wing, thoughts that might otherwise vanish. It seems inevitable the shorthand card was dispensed with after a superseding pencil to ink translation, and more than one sense of that word translation is pertinent, I think. Only in ink does the hymn become fully achieved. Without the card, though, we don't get the completest view of the hymn's full textual life. Fortunately, not all evidence of compositional process is lost. From marginal and interlineal notation, if present, we glimpse contemplation of alternatives in drafting. Scholars have always immersed themselves in such things. The critical apparatus of a good edition helps reconstruct the complexities of original documents. But translation from shorthand manuscript to print has parallels with that from pencil to pen in Moore's vignette. Readers might gain clarity, but something still gets lost in the process. Today, my focus isn't on transitional, ephemeral aspects of shorthand as interim text carrier, though. My point is that shorthand shouldn't be seen merely as a vehicle for semantic meaning, and I want to focus more on the page. I want to focus more on it, on the page and its contexts. And in order to do so, I need to say more about the inventor of the system the Wesleys used. So who was John Byron? In a 1756 journal entry, Charles Wesley, always the closer of the two brothers to him, called him my candid friend and censor. He was never a Methodist, but his regular contact with Fetter Lane and Little Britain circles prompted George Stonehouse's observation in 1739 that he was taken for one. Stonehouse, to whom Charles was serving as curate, was an early Methodist convert, and it's hardly mere coincidence that Stonehouse was learning Byron's shorthand at the time too. If Byron's remembered at all today, it's usually as author of the Christmas hymn Christians Awake, just one item in his heterogeneous verse output. Poet hardly describes him, though, adequately. One-time fellow of Trinity Cambridge, failed medic, he always disowned the honorific doctor title that the Wesleys and others accorded him, regional political activist, Royal Society fellow, religious seeker. He's difficult to pigeonhole. The brothers included two of Byron's translations in their first hymns collection, but what Byron called its preface against the mystics caused a long-standing rift with John in particular. Nevertheless, in his journal, the latter enthused about Byron and his poems, made better known posthumously by featuring in the Armenian magazine, probably influencing Methodist printer James Nichols to publish a second edition of Byron's verse in 1814. Byron devised his new method of shorthand, later called his Universal English System, by the early 1720s, and shelved an initial project to publish it in manual form, to concentrate on teaching it personally for a princely 5-guinea fee, drawing pupils mainly from Cambridge colleges and the Inns of Court. You'll be relieved to know I'm not going to run through the technicalities of the system, but I want to make two quick, simple, generalized points about why his clients might have been led to believe his was a significant advance on rival systems. First was its claimed rational basis, the way that particular strokes were allocated to consonants, apparently with letter frequency in mind. Second was rejection of what were termed arbitraries or symbolicals, that is to say, long lists of sometimes bizarre ideographs representing words and phrases, which you might recall made shorthand, memorizing shorthand so miserable for poor David Copperfield. Here are some quick examples of the sort of thing I mean. The page on the left is from a 1760s edition of a popular 17th century system, still being reprinted in the 1790s. Such things are a bit like antecedents of emoticons or symbols in 21st century text messaging, as in the irreverent example on the right in green. Can anyone work it out? You have to turn it on its side and see it vertically. The answer is John Wesley after 9 hours on a horse. This sort of thing has no place in Byron's system. No place in Byron's system. Condensed contracting might make it frustrating, at times seemingly impenetrable, but there's always a fundamental alphabetic or phonetic, not symbolic or ideographic basis to that contracting. Applications of Byron's shorthand, like any system, were legion. It was used in transcribing, annotating, interlining, drafting, docketing, for commonplacing, note-taking, corresponding, journal keeping. What Byron called his system's beauty was his marketing's cornerstone. This beauty was displayed not just on paper substrates. Here on the slide is a nice bit of scriptural hollow cutting, circa 1730, probably by his sister Phoebe, but also on glass, linen, even here on stone, the intriguing funeral monument of Jane Delamont, wife of the Oxford Methodist in that Needles of the Friends letter. With her identity effectively hidden from those who can't read it, maybe somehow this served as a lesson about humility, but it certainly pointed to an identity in which shorthand held significance as a communication system, whether in the immediate family or their wider Moravian circles. I'm going to say now a little bit more about the background of John and Charles's starting Byron shorthand. Use of abbreviated writing was long established in their family. Their mother's journal meditations contain shorthand-type symbols, and their father's correspondence deliberately deploys suspensions, superscripts, macrons, a sort of short longhand, saving paper and time, perfectly common scribal practice. This slides from a notebook kept by their younger sister, Kezzy, around 1729. Here she's transcribing a poem by Matthew Prior. The lighter ink, making things a horrible mess here, is in a later hand, expanding the abbreviations, very much resembling those deployed by other Wesleys. Editors have always liked to tidy such things up. For example, in the bicentennial edition first volume of John's letters, we read how clarity for the general reader's clarity is gained by silently amending, quote, the antiquarian minutiae of abbreviations. But I think sometimes this can come at a cost. When it comes to transcribing shorthand, normalization brings benefits of clarity and consistency, sure, but if it modernizes or removes clues to a writer's pronunciation, say, or silently introduces or amends punctuation, the problem is it hides evidence, taking us a little further from authorial voice. And what's wrong with antiquarianism, especially if that antiquarianism brings us closer to a scene of writing? Having said that, considerable editorial unpacking is of course vital to understand the far more developed and complex manifestations of John's short longhand, occurring in what are known as his Oxford diaries, a set of notebooks kept between 1725 and 1735, for whose unravelling and decoding we owe so much to Professor Richard Heitzenreiter. His edition of them isn't yet out, on the slide, but is eagerly awaited and will cast more light on the early context I'm merely sketching. Here's a couple of pages from Wesley's 1725-7 notebook. Abbreviations here might be thought a sort of shorthand for concision, confidentiality, space saving, and so on, but it's very different from the types of writing system I'm talking about here. From Wesley's expenses books, we know that in 1731 he was acquainted with the most lavish shorthand manual of the day, stenography completed 1727 by James Weston, a thorn in Byron's side. I've read that Wesley taught Weston to his Oxford students, although I must say I'm not clear about the evidence for that. Perhaps it's the context of a letter he received from another Lincoln fellow, William Smith, who referred to taking up a full fortnight learning. The bottom reference on this slide is from Wesley's 1734 accounts, and I think that rather being anything to do with Weston, it indicates payment to Byron. I say this because in the course of journeys between Oxford and Epworth over 1733 to 5, they definitely met in Manchester, and I think it's pretty likely they'd have got sight of the system there, perhaps initially on 16 May 1733, when he visited Byron's house. Conceivably, he'd seen it earlier, for example, during a visit to Cambridge in 1731, when he had supper at the Mitre, hosted by one Russell of St. John's, where a shorthand club regularly met, and St. John's was Byron's most important source of pupils at the time. Sorry, I didn't read that sentence out very well. Whatever the case, the person instrumental in his conversion from Weston's to Byron's system was, I'm convinced, their mutual friend, John Clayton of Brasenose, which is a great excuse for this lovely conversation piece depicting Clayton at his Salford school. I'm entirely comfortable with the claim that Byron is sitting second right. Family tradition went that recitation of Byron's own verse was taking place here, and that one of the boys is Byron's son Teddy. Wesley met Byron in the company of Clayton and other Manchester High Church non-juror figures, and the tightness of this circle is nicely epitomised by how Byron acronymizes them, Habadback, in this shorthand notebook at the time, transcribing prayers and patristic material. We know much more about the group's influence on Wesley's early thinking about primitive ecclesiology, thanks to Jordan Hammond's brilliant study, John Wesley in America. What's less known is that these men were also early Byron users. Here's an example, the non-juror Thomas Deacon writing to Byron, styled here mock masonically as Grand Master of Shorthand, where shorthand in yellow masks evidence of their co-authorship of a pamphlet written against the Whig Bishop Samuel Peploe. Clayton was an active member of the club of Byron's shorthand pupils in the late 1720s, and sufficiently accomplished to be allowed to teach it. Here he is, coaching Wesley in the system a few years later. Setting out a transcription of the shorthand line by line, he creates a parallel text, tantamount to a lesson by post, about using a letter P symbol plus dot to indicate the word possibly, and how to write suffixes. The document's significant for proving Wesley knew Byron's system, or at least something of it, over a year before this entry, 6th of December 1736, in what's known as his second Georgia diary. The entry says, began shorthand. The B in green is his short longhand abbreviation for began. But in the light of the Clayton letter, I don't think what's meant is learning completely from scratch, but more in the way of resuming it in earnest, probably influenced by Charles's urging in his Needles letter, and I think with Delamott closely involved too. Entries in ensuing days duly show shorthand got incorporated in his morning study programme. The first instance of its actual use in this notebook seems to be here on December the 19th, occasional words within a set of resolutions, and the first diary entry using it comes the next day, December the 20th, in the yellow, fitted in confusingly at the bottom of the earlier June page. De la Motte appears right at its start at 4 in the morning. Could the jottings I've highlighted in green be his, I wonder? They seem like demonstrations or corrections, while the other shorthand seems more laborious, a beginner anxious to distinguish colons from vowel dots, making slips and unorthodox character junctions. We also glimpse Wesley realizing a need to be more phonetic. For example, in the blue, he improves in writing the word scheme, shedding orthographical hang-ups at the second attempt. Here's a couple of slightly later pages from his so-called London diaries, showing marked improvement when back in England. Note how the longhand proper names stand out against the main body shorthand. These are documents designed for longer-term reconsultation, and this contrast makes things considerably easier than if you'd only used shorthand or only longhand. So what were shorthand's attractions for the Wesleys? They fit broadly into 3 overlapping categories: capturing speech, securing privacy, and enhancing time efficiency. And I'll say a little bit more about each in turn. It's easy to forget how valuable, even amazing it was that shorthand was used to capture the spoken word and speak it back in an age before mechanized sound recording. Charles's early journal contains 2 passages, definitely based on shorthand transcripts. First mate Graham's conversation with Captain Indivine shortly before the Needles of a Friend's Letter, and Captain Corney's narration about Peter Appy. Other significant matter presented dramatically as direct speech, probably also derived from shorthand, notably conversations with Oglethorpe and Mrs. Welsh, an exchange with William Law, 2 conferences with Archbishop Potter, and an interrogation by justices of the peace. But it's telling Charles made the captain repeat his account. 2 or 3, maybe more writing stints were necessary to arrive at a satisfactory record, entailing a collation of versions. Even if he'd been a faster writer, I doubt he could realistically have looked at any system of time for 100% verbatim transcription. Byron himself took shorthand in churches and law courts, but was far more cautious than his rivals in making claims about this. Learners might, he said, in a few months be able to follow a speaker. But following wasn't tantamount to verbatim recording. Charles's journal reference, transcribe the declarations taken from their mouth, highlights a gap between the taking and the transcription, during which syntax and vocabulary would get tidied up and supplemented as a matter of course. These plates of sermon-taking scenes come from manuals of 2 of Byron's rivals, Weston, mentioned earlier, and the wonderfully named Orley Macaulay. Both also advertise the benefits of shorthand for privacy, the second key reason for wanting to learn it. Macaulay called his method a kind of innocent cipher, for setting down a multitude of private concerns in such a manner as without it we should scarcely incline to set them to paper. Methodist sympathies in Macaulay's family seem to explain its being adopted by John Bennet, who used it to just this end in transcribing John Wesley letters. The highlighted words in Macaulay's system say marriage, John Wesley, and John Bennet. He presented a copy of this manual to Bennet in 1748 in Manchester, with copies for John Nelson and Mr. Wesley, I assume John, probably hoping they'd promote it. If he'd ever examined it, Wesley would have quickly realized its inferiority, but Macaulay's presence on the scene must have been unsettling to Byron, not simply as he was undercutting his tuition rates on home turf. I'm using this little example partly to show Byron's wasn't the only system early Methodists were using. On the flyer for today's lecture, the sharper-eyed amongst you will have noticed another system, even though it's on a Wesley letter. It's here at Lincoln, and I was delighted when these uniform Max pointed it out. The longhands printed in the bicentennial edition, the editor mentions but doesn't decipher this shorthand, which he thought might be an endorsement by the recipient James Harvey. It does seem to be an odd place for an endorsement, I had wondered whether it could be added by Wesley, reaching out in a system that Harvey knew to Harvey to sort of suggest that he was conversant with this. Peter has pointed out to me and spoiled my theory just an hour or so ago, pointed out that it doesn't show Wesley's line of writing, that it probably isn't by him. Even so, I think it's an interesting little mystery to be solved. I'm very sorry I failed you all and myself in not having done so in time for today. But I think we need to get this deciphered. Maybe somebody has. Here's an example of a John Wesley letter using Byron's system for concealment, knowing its intended recipient wouldn't be the only one seeing it. It implies he'd been criticised for want of duty towards his late mother, which he rejects as unfair, apart from the fact, the shorthand says, that I have not reproved her as fully and plainly as I should have done. Far more evidence of shorthand for concealment can be found in the journal letters Charles sent him. Here's one example where after the longhand, which would have been circulated and read out to and then transcribed by others, there's a separated private communication. Here's the bit circled in green. Note the longhand against some potentially tricky words, thematica, verjuice, crabtree, Catholic, to help John unravel them, emphasising how Charles was the more advanced stenographer of the two. It's well known that Charles's journal used shorthand to hide sensitive matters, the tone of this material ranging from outrage to intimate retrospection. Hide isn't quite the right word though, for within a predominantly longhand context, the shorthand draws attention to itself, particularly when so distinctly formed like this. It cries out, "Decipher me," but Jackson omitted it in his 1849 edition, and Telford exercised discretion in his of 1910, including only some of what Kernock had just transcribed for him. Not surprisingly, in the 1736-9 manuscript, the shorthand covers matters about sexual impropriety charges in Georgia, and in the 1740-51 part, some of what it covers merited even more discretion with regard to rifts between the brothers and their attitudes to marriage, masking a far more complex and nuanced picture than once presented. Thanks to the Kimbrough-Newport edition, where shorthand's occurrence is helpfully emboldened typographically, this material is now better known. Sometimes I think equating of shorthand with secret codes can be too reflex, even unduly sensationalized though. We do well to remember it was the key to his desk drawer, not the shorthand per se, which kept Pepys's diary secret. The third area of why the Wesleys might want to use shorthand is more mundane, but perhaps fundamentally more important, because it relates to Jeremy Taylor's first rule of holy living, the right care of one's time. In a scribal world, long before office duplicators and camera phones, shorthand's role in lessening the drudgery of routine copying increased efficiencies of production and economy. Less time spent writing, less paper required. Clergyman Thomas Harvey made the concept of redeeming time the title of this 1780s system, one he claimed wrongly would be of service to ex-Byron users. The writing at the top here is by the evangelist Isaac Milner, incidentally, showing him trying to learn some of the many Harvey arbitraries. Thomas Shelton's mid-17th century estimate of roughly 1 page or hour of shorthand, equating to 6 of longhand, was echoed by later stenographers well into the 18th. As well as paper, there were potential savings in postage costs too, as the post office charged by the sheet. A significant amount of Charles's correspondence is known not from sent holographs, but from survivals of holograph copies or drafts, utilizing blank space in letters he was replying to, another space-saving benefit. Here's one to John Horton, where the draft's put immediately below Horton's signature, and one to Selina, Countess of Huntingdon, written adjacent to the address panel when the letter's folded out. So in reading transcripts of such things, especially where they appear coherent rather than skeletal, Always remember they might be highlights or abridgments. They're at a far remove from the actual sent reply letter. Charles also used shorthand to copy out others' letters to him or his circle. An important example is a notebook where he made extracts from over 60 of Lady Huntingdon's letters, for the majority of which there's no known longhand state. It was only in 2020 that these were fully deciphered and published, in the words of their editor, Randy Maddox, a shorthand treasure trove. I hope some of my slides have been showing that shorthand could be very neat, visually appealing even. Maybe in its minimalism of ink or lead on the page, and a simplicity and plainness, in contrast, say, with the Baroque flourishings beloved of 18th century writing masters, Byron held an appeal to early Methodist aesthetic sensibilities. Its geometric basis and its principle of lineality, requiring that characters did not extend outside parallel writing lines, helped bestow and print-like neatness and clarity in examples like these, from a notebook of verse copies. Charles' penmanship was envied by the inventor himself. I shame at my own writing when I see the neatness of yours, Byron told him, praising his being, quote, so complete a master. One instance of such mastery was displayed over 40 years later in the Book of Common Prayer in shorthand, proudly inscribed, finished July 12, 1779, in a fortnight, by C.W., aged 70. I'm so sorry I don't have a slide of this. It's nothing like the horseback card jotting. He'd have had no intention of then copying it out further into longhand. The shorthand is calligraphy. They're not just to be read, but to be seen in its own right. I think that this and some similar transcriptions by him might illuminate journal references like began the New Testament or stay till noon transcribing Isaiah. Such acts of textual absorption might have been ones of writing just as much as reading. Need for a personal copy or a content refamiliarization exercise can't be the explanation for such effort. It's more likely the manuscript was intended as a gift or teaching aid for its recipient's reading practice, assisting the deciphering of other shorthand in turn. Teaching shorthand was one of two ways in which Charles was not just a consumer of Byron's system, but an active promulgator of it. As early as 1737, he was probably instructing clergyman John Hook, which would make him part of an elite and trusted group of Byron's delegates. Trusted because he'd have been bound to the strict condition it wasn't linked to outsiders. Piracy risks increased as learner numbers did, and Byron tried, not entirely successfully, to keep it a trade secret before its printing, even securing a parliamentary act to protect his rights. Charles's understanding of the need for discretion is shown in letters to Walter Selland, a master at Kingswood, the school John founded in 1748. Selland appears to have learnt from an unauthorized source, occasioning forthright criticism of his stenography. You're a poor writer of shorthand. Perhaps I may teach you better when we meet, on Dr. Byron's condition that you purchase a book when published. Whoever taught you your scraps was a thief and a robber. The unnamed miscreant hadn't just ripped off Selland with poor instruction, but also ripped off Byron by not handing on the tuition money. In a subsequent letter exhorting Selland to keep your scraps of shorthand to yourself, it was implied he was John Meryton, a young curate who accompanied the Wesleys on several of their tours. This cast light on a letter to Mary Jones, asking her to remind Meryton to return, quote, a shorthand psalter, which I lent him. I assume that was a manuscript penned by Charles himself, functioning a bit like the Common Prayer book I mentioned. The Kingswood connection seems significant. Mary Jones was mother of one of its first pupils, and at the time of its foundation, shorthand was on the syllabus. I haven't proved that that was Byron's system, but I'm rather convinced it was, because the first headmaster, John Jones, no relation to Mary, used it in the salutation and sign-off of this letter, requesting the loan of some manuscript sermons. The shorthand, Reverend and Dear Sir, suggests Jones wasn't a regular writer, though. It's a very careful, almost pedantic bit of writing in spelling out reverend with a sort of carefully placed vowel dots more experienced writers would avoid. There's similar deliberation in documents like these. On the left, a letter from Edward Perronnay to John Wesley. On the right, one from John Downes to Charles. Further evidence of take-up of Byron in the Wesley circle. Even if Jones wasn't as adept as these two, his letter shows he at least knew something of the system and wanted to highlight his knowledge to his recipient. He's asserting a stenographic bond. Looking ahead, by the early 19th century, Byron's system became more widely disseminated by additions and adaptations aimed at a growing vocational and schools market. It may well have been from something like this manual that Methodist youth attending Woodhouse Grove School learned it. Charles also taught shorthand to Sarah Gwynne when they were engaged, ending a letter to her with the instruction, advice or plea, "Don't forget your shorthand." This later portrait occurs by John Russell, an artist who himself came to be a great adept at Byron's shorthand, probably through the Wesleys' influence. Learning shorthand is mentioned in correspondence after their marriage too. In this coda, in the clearly formed and vowel-dotted outlines one would use to write to a relative novice, a bit like that in that Jones letter, Charles says, "If you desire to oblige me, go on with your shorthand and music." A few months later, she's implored again not to neglect her shorthand, along with her music and prayers. The second way in which Charles actively promulgated Byron's shorthand was to do with his connection to moves to publish a manual of it through subscription. A publication model where basically an author issued proposals for their book, received deposits from subscribers, and later, once it was actually written, published and delivered, the balance. That was the idea anyway. The Wesleys had a fair bit of experience with this type of collective patronage. John's support of the Equiano book I mentioned earlier is one example where his name is contained in the subscribers list. Here's a receipt for Samuel's dissertations on Job, along with a similar receipt for Byron's earlier abandoned shorthand projects. In the mid-1730s, Byron was reluctant to start a new campaign, but was persuaded, almost coerced, into doing so by a group of backers headed by the physician and philosopher David Hartley, who was convinced of its major public benefit. Some even had hopes for it going beyond what we conventionally think of as shorthand. Linking it with spelling reform, they saw it potentially as a universal hand in its own right, supplanting a system in which literacy for many still required mastery of successive scripts. One of Byron's supporters thought that in a decade, people might, quote, lay aside longhand altogether. Charles became involved with this group. Informing Byron, he'd gathered promises of support from 20 to 30 people. He also offered to take in subscriptions personally. He wasn't the only Oxford Methodist involved here. Charles Kinchin, Fellow of Corpus, appears in a rare printed recommendation of 1737 they organised. This reveals that Kinchin took payments for Byron's subscribers in Oxford and at least had basic knowledge of the system. So did Kinchin's later curate, the Oxford Methodist John Hutchins of Pembroke, whom Byron called Kinchin's shorthand scholar. In exploring the system's user networks, it's hardly mere coincidence we uncover also the likes of Benjamin Ingham of Queen's, who, like the Wesleys, converted from Weston to Byron, MP James Erskine, later Charles's legal advisor, who also learnt it in the mid-1730s, and bookseller James Hutton, a founding figure of the Fetter Lane Society, who became a receiver for shorthand subscriptions in 1741. Charles duly appeared as a signatory to a new recommendation of 1739, revised in 1741 and again in 1765. Without revealing anything about the system, this asserted its easiness to learn and how it was, quote, perfectly regular and beautiful and the shortest possible. In these documents, he rubbed shoulders with some eminent names at the time, like antiquary Martin Folkes, playwright Benjamin Hoadley, astronomer Robert Smith, and foundling hospital philanthropist Taylor White, together with less eminent Manchester clergy in Green. Bold predictions in Hartley's circle envisaged it becoming one of the major subscriptions of the day. But Charles's report of his 20 or 30 names is actually the largest known indication of support being gathered, and even that cannot be taken as proof of paid subscription. For various reasons, not least protracted problems over technology for printing rather than engraving shorthand, Byron kicked the can down the road with actually writing his manual, and his backers became impatient, some giving up on him entirely. But Charles always expected it to appear, which it did 4 years after Byron's death, based on unfinished manuscripts, abridged and conflated by those who took charge of them. As the manual's preface incorporated the last recommendation list, Charles's name appears printed inside. Here's its title page, featuring a device of the ellipsis-based properties of Byron's characters. And I can't resist mentioning that someone called Thomas Boyes later claimed bizarrely that George Whitfield lurks in one of the flowers in the border. The reader of this particular copy seems to have thought so. Perhaps it was Boyes' people joke. The manual's now the first port of call for learning to decipher writing in Byron. We should remember the Wesleys didn't have such a manual, of course, but it's worth pointing out that when Charles in particular used highly condensed, advanced shorthand, this was totally in keeping with Byron's 17 rules of abbreviation in the book. These are examples using Rule 7, where a dot before two consonants indicates a phrase containing a conjunction, where you'll see its context surrounding the words that's so crucial in deciphering. And here's Rule 14. He wasn't writing in some adapted or idiosyncratic or variant version, as I've sometimes seen asserted. It's entirely Byron. Still, there remains much of it which eludes confident, even unconfident transcriptions. And there's so much in what has been prevented that's inevitably conjectural. It's not just challenging phrase strings like this. Sometimes it's at a simple word level. Just a letter followed by a dot, occasionally numerous possibilities for expansion. So in the last part of this lecture, I'd like to say just a little about deciphering shorthand, taking some small examples of how things aren't clear-cut from our needles of the Friends letter. This was first edited by Frank Baker in John Wesley's Letters, Volume 1. Unless my needling away seems disrespectful, I say immediately I'm in awe of the achievement of Baker, whose Anatomy of a Letter section in this volume is a great introduction to the materiality of 18th century correspondence, but I'm surprised isn't known more widely. Although the shorthand is clearly penned, Baker was a bit stumped by the word in green, and his footnotes up front about it. Quote, "It seems to be needles, but allowing for two minor errors might be nibbles, which might be a means of communication to fidget or play with the fingers." His ignorance of the sympathetic telegraph allusion is perfectly understandable. I only happened upon that by searching Google, which of course wasn't available to him. But the conjecture is entirely reliant on assuming an error. So the ingenious nibbles reading thence appears in his text, albeit in round brackets, although their precise function isn't clarified either. Baker was unclear about an earlier bit too, understandably given the condition. Seal breaking has led to a big tear. It's the bit in blue, top right, which appears to start with a B, which he conjectured as beginning. It seems a good fit, it makes sense, it reads coherently, but from a paleographical viewpoint, it's unsatisfactory. Faced with such challenges, it's always helpful to try to think as a shorthand writer, not just a reader. Byron's alphabet has two distinct shapes for B to facilitate connection. Depending on the next consonant, you'd use one, not the other. If Charles had meant to write a beginning, he'd have formed his initial B differently, a curved upstroke, but it's a curved downstroke. You may safely depend upon my word that the word Byron's would be a securer reading, one with the added benefit of better contextual sense, given the longhand reference to Byron early in the letter. It's still entirely conjectural, though. I'm pleased my editors were persuaded to adopt needles in their new transcription of this document, which now supersedes Baker. But once shorthand manuscript turns into print transcript, and I hold up my hands to complicity in this, a stage of fixture is affected that's difficult to dislodge. That's why Baker's conjectured beginning is still entertained as the primary possibility. My suggestion of Byron's at least gets footnote citation as an alternative, so that's gratifying. But readers mustn't infer that beginning and Byron are the only possibilities. It might be any number of things beginning with B. And is it definitely a B? And look at how big that missing section is. Space for 2 or 3, maybe more words. General editorial policies mean neither text cares to show that only, in pink, is Charles's superscripted insertion, a tiny detail admittedly, but the process of writing an emphatic afterthought might just be worth capturing. Unfortunately, Baker's reliance on photocopies meant underlinings in the manuscript led to some words ending up in italics, imposing a false emphasis at the beginning. I'm amazed. False because non-authorial. Studying the manuscript, we find these underlinings actually in different ink by a later reader in the act of deciphering. These small examples show why it's vital to go back to the manuscripts. After all, it's pretty impossible to grasp points made in editorial footnotes about shorthand without seeing them. So it's wonderful that more's being done now to make images available online. Kernock would have approved. He prided himself on being up to date with his tech. His Kodak instantaneous camera was acquired soon after its patenting, and work on his edition benefited from photographing of Wesley manuscripts he personally supervised over, quote, many months, involving the use of more than 3,000 dry plates. But he could have only dreamed of digitalization with all its opportunities for enhancing manuscript exploration, providing the distinction between mediated and original states is always remembered. And even if it doesn't yet provide a truly haptic experience. I can imagine a future generation of Wesley manuscript scholars invited into shorthand paleography by the linking of digitalized images to deciphered expansions in new types of edition, proffering fuller ways of thinking about multiple readings. By increasing multimodal, dynamic, and collaborative editorial approaches, the equivalence of the needles needn't lie dormant until the once-in-a-lifetime moment of a volume's printing. This doesn't preclude traditional facing page facsimile transcription editions either, of which there's a dearth when it comes to Wesley manuscripts. They'd be so useful whether or not the machine stops, to quote E.M. Forster's chilling prophecy about things like Zoom lectures, published the same year as Kernock's edition. Digital or print, more tools like these are needed, as there's plenty out there to edit and re-edit. For example, only in 2020, this previously unknown notebook emerged at auction containing Wesley hymns, with new material and textual variants to keep scholars happy. It's now at the Rylands, and something in it I'm particularly excited by is a mid-1750s list in Charles's hand of Dr. Byron's subscribers. The editors of the OUP letters rightly acknowledge that their work cannot be considered final. Quote, it's almost certain that further text will emerge. That's indeed proved the case, and I've been collaborating on deciphering shorthand in more Wesley letters with Randy Maddox for the Duke Online Resources Project. The way the internet and e-communication facilitates this often makes me think of Porter's Sympathetic Telegraph. Certainly, needles came to mind when Randy electronically stitched together a shorthand letter addressed to Charles, intriguingly not in Byron's system, from 2 scraps found in libraries on opposite sides of the planet. There's still plenty of undeciphered Methodist shorthand beyond the Wesleys too, to keep us busy. Peter Forsyth and I plan a project involving transcription of much minutely written Byron by the painter John Russell, mentioned earlier. There's a famous example on the right. You can see how difficult that is. It's tiny. And it's not just the material in Byron. What about the Lincoln Archives letter? For starters, not to mention James Harvey's own manuscripts, or numerous shorthand hymn books and various other systems, might we find links here to the most famous of all stenographers and a Methodist in his earlier days, Isaac Pitman. And back in the period I've been focusing on, how did an obscure printed book of 1741, claiming to collate Weston and Byron shorthand alphabets to communicate all languages, come to call itself the Methodist? And who was behind it? So in conclusion, there's plenty more to do to build a bigger picture of the Wesley shorthand and how it fits into a broader stenographic landscape. And the more pairs of eyes viewing this landscape, the better. I hope I've persuaded you that readers of transcribed shorthand might gain something from appreciating how it's been encoded, the history of its material writing. Because thinking about shorthand isn't just deciphering or establishing readings, it relates crucially to context and intention, and hence meaning in a broader sense. And on that wider note, I finish my lecture. Thank you all so much for coming here or being out there today.